Let's introduce the key components of the ITIL 4 framework, comprising of the 4 dimensions of service management and the service value system. The 4 dimensions of service management represent the 4 critical elements that make up products and services. The products and services which an organisation provide do not stand alone. In other words, they do not stand on fresh air. Such products and services come about through a balanced interaction of an organisation's resources, and organisations own or have access to a variety of resources, including organisations and people, information and technology, partners and suppliers, and value streams and processes. Products are configurations of these resources created to provide potential value for customers. Now, the 4 dimensions of service management, or sometimes referred to as the 4-dimension model, represent internal resources, or we could refer to these as what we deem as a provider's operational excellence. However, what we see on the outside of the 4 dimensions of service management is what we refer to as an acronym PESTLE. This refers to those political factors, economical factors, social factors, technological factors, legal factors, and environmental factors. These represent those external factors that, whilst can create opportunities in demand, can also pose threats to our resources. For example, political change can either create an opportunity or can become a threat. When we look at the environmental factor, for example, COVID-19 impacted almost every organisation. If we consider the legal factor, as an example, GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, impacts our resources in such a way that determines how we now design for and manage the handling and processing of people's personal information. Okay, the service value system represents how the various components and activities of the organisation work together to facilitate value creation through IT-enabled services. The purpose of the service value system is to realise value. These components comprise of the guiding principles, governance, the service value chain, practices, and continual improvement. The guiding principles help an organisation to make good decisions in all circumstances, regardless of changes in its strategic goals and objectives. Every system needs a governing body based on strategic direction. The service value chain, which is the operating model of the service value system, actually transforms inputs into outputs, which are the products and services. Practices are the resources for practitioners to perform work in the service value chain, and every system has to ensure continual alignment with the needs of the business, hence continual improvement. When we consider the 4 dimensions of service management in relation to the service value system, in crude simple terms, we could take a view something like this. We first need the resources, the 4 dimensions of service management, in order to have a system, the service value system. Of course, without the resources, there is no system, and it is the service value system, more so the operating model, the service value chain, which create products and services, which are indeed the outputs that facilitate outcomes, the results, which stakeholders want and that are valuable for stakeholders. The reason why we have other components in addition to the operating model, which also make up the system, we could refer to the human body, because the human body is also a system made up of a number of components. So whilst the operating model of the service value system appears to compare with the legs of the human body, for example, which moves the human body from A to B, the human body needs other components to help to achieve this, such as the brain, the heart and the lungs, etc. So in the case of the ITIL service value system, in addition to the operating model, the service value chain, we need the guiding principles, governance, practices and continual improvement. I hope this makes sense. When I walk into some IT organisations, and I do underline the word some, I ask one question: what services do we provide to the business? This is an important question to ask, especially when services are the most important and common link between IT and the business. After all, IT exists to contribute to the performance of the company's core business assets, such as that bar of soap which the company manufactures. In this case, IT service management is indeed responsible for contributing to ensuring that this bar of soap sits on the shelf in the supermarket in a quality state and produced at a price the consumer is prepared to pay. Whether IT, HR, finance, etc., we are all in this together. So, it is expected that the services IT provide are clearly defined. Unfortunately, however, when I ask this question, some organisations respond with total silence. In fact, on occasions, some will respond with, "We are busy doing stuff." How do we quantify stuff? How do we measure stuff? This is far too ambiguous. So it is clear that these organisations have never defined the services which they provide. And, to be brutally honest, such organisations have defined very little about themselves. I could talk all day about the importance of clearly defining things, but let me just cover a few aspects. Firstly, when we look at roles, including responsibilities, some organisations confuse titles with roles. Titles on the shop floor, as to speak, are pretty much useless, albeit I do accept that titles are indeed important when it comes to executive decision making, governance, and of course HR place a great deal of importance on titles to support the company's grading structure, for example, such as salaries, management privileges, status, and so on. However, in terms of how people contribute to the value chain, titles play no part whatsoever. For example, if someone introduces themselves to me, such as "My name is X and I am the first line support agent for this company," or "My name is X and I am the infrastructure manager for this company," I am none the wiser. Because I know that first line support in one company may mean that this person has a degree of technical expertise, whereas in another organisation, this person may simply pass messages around the company. There is nothing wrong in either of these models. It all depends on the strategic model of the organisation. However, in this context, title alone is simply too ambiguous. An infrastructure manager in one company may mean that this person or people are deeply ingrained within the infrastructure technologies, whereas in another company, the infrastructure manager may simply just be familiar with a couple of servers within the building. So we cannot make sense of titles. If someone were to set up their own business, they can actually give themselves whatever title they want. Whereas if someone introduces themselves to me with such as "My name is X and I'm the infrastructure manager for this company and my key responsibilities comprise of problem management and capacity and performance management," then I know exactly what outputs that this person is expected to produce and where these outputs go and the recipient of these outputs and what outcomes the recipient is expected to achieve from these outputs. And we have only just met. And it is not just roles where such ambiguity lies. Let's look at policies and processes. Firstly, a process is a vehicle to execute a policy. Processes satisfy policies. A process is defined as a set of interconnected or interrelated activities that transform one or more inputs into one or more defined outputs. In other words, it's the stuff we actually do, the work we actually carry out to produce outputs. However, in some organisations, these processes do not map to policies, when in fact they should. Trust me, these can be codified. So this lack of clarity results in processes growing organically on the shop floor. Therefore, these policies are clearly not being followed. I have come across situations where the author of a policy, i.e. a person or a team who has composed such a policy, store these policies on a document management system such as SharePoint, and that's it. In fact, they themselves have since forgotten where the policy was stored and certainly cannot recall the contents of the policy. And in the event when such a policy is needed, they spend half a day trying to find the policy and then the rest of the day familiarising themselves with its content, and then have the audacity to start wielding the policy around the organisation, accusing people of not following it. This shortfall also becomes evident when audits are carried out. And on the topic of audits, I should highlight that management should regularly audit their teams themselves for maturity assessment and not just rely on external audits. But this rarely happens in some organisations. Okay, back to policies and processes. If processes are not mapped to policies, then people will find the best way of doing things. In other words, the processes, i.e. the activities, simply grow organically on the shop floor. So these organically developed activities may be breaching policy on a daily basis. Or maybe these organically developed processes are a marked improvement on the policy, meaning the policies are in need of update. But if they are not mapped, then how are such updates identified? Now let's look at IT service management system tools. Many organisations have branded system tools such as ServiceNow, Fresh Service, Manage Engine, Cherwell, and it goes on. The business have invested in these tools because these tools are able to provide essential management information, and not to mention support modern thinking technologies. However, when we look at, for example, an incident ticket, the only information we see on this ticket is an entry stating all fixed or customer happy. We do not need such expensive and comprehensive system tools to produce that level of information. We can produce this level of information on a spreadsheet. Well, in fact, we could produce this level of information on the back of a post-it. Furthermore, when we look at the knowledge base which this system has incorporated within it, we see nothing there. It's empty. Or if not, there is nothing worth looking at. Okay, now let's look at improvement and measurement. Every organisation claims to be fully committed to improvement, but in some organisations we cannot see what we are improving from because there is nothing defined, so everything is too ambiguous. Of course, when things break and subsequently repaired, this indeed is improvement by default. But this is more reactive improvement. What about proactive improvement? I come back to my point. There is nothing sufficiently defined to identify where we are improving from. For clarification, a baseline is a marker for later comparison. A crude analogy could be that we have document version 1. This is our current defined baseline. When we introduce document version 2, this new document becomes our new baseline. If we can reference from the previous image being document version 1, we can use this as a form of measurement of improvement. Okay, in summary, the downside of such ambiguity and lack of definition within an organisation does not just impact efficiency, but also impacts staff morale, meaning such ambiguity can open doors to bully boy tactics, blame culture, and point scoring. People accusing people of not applying common sense when such common sense should be defined. I have seen people leave companies because the job is seen as stressful, when in fact the stress typically comes from the ambiguity which exists, and in turn the blame culture that comes with it. Firstly, it should be highlighted that if you have not defined something, then you cannot control it. And if you cannot control something, then you cannot measure it. And if you cannot measure something, then you simply cannot manage. Okay. Now, ITIL is a public framework composed of methodologies and principles from the best in class from around the world. In simple terms, ITIL focuses on best practice for IT service management. So we do not need to rewrite common sense. We can take advantage of techniques and approaches that have been tried and tested, exactly the same as with other best practice frameworks such as DevOps, Lean, Prince2, Agile, Scrum, and so on. However, the biggest mistake some organisations make is treating these as competing alternatives, when in fact they are not competing alternatives. In some organisations, we see various teams promoting their opinion of what they believe is the best framework, when in fact each of these frameworks have their own shortfalls, if compared with aspects that are not core to what they represent. So when I see these best practice frameworks being treated as competing alternatives within an organisation, it becomes evident to me that these organisations clearly do not have their own in-house framework. So my question is, where is our framework? What we should be doing is taking the relevant parts from each of these best practice frameworks and branding it as our own. A brand that is contextual and relevant to our business, and one that does not just talk the walk, but facilitates a culture that actually walks the talk. But no. What do we actually do? We copy and paste these books as they stand straight into the organisation, and this simply does not work. Of course, we should be adopting these frameworks. That is why these frameworks exist. However, what we fail to do is adapt these to the relevancy and context of our organisation. In terms of ITIL, we should not simply regurgitate the ITIL book as it stands. Once we come back from the ITIL classroom, we should remove the ITIL badge and make it ours. Let me go one step further. I have helped organisations introduce their own in-house IT service management certification scheme. Let me explain. The reason why ITIL students take an exam is to communicate back to the examination institute that they have understood the topic. Now, as we know, such exams comprise of generic questions, so we could create our own in-house exams. Let's take request management as an example. We could introduce questions relating to HR wanting a new PC. These questions would be specific and contextual, such as what form do we complete? An R1 form or a 2B form? What is the SLA? What is the desktop configuration? And what is the procedure for signing off at desk side? And it goes on. By doing this, we are communicating back to management that the workforce understand the job. This also greatly assists with appraisals and internal career development, and not to mention a fantastic way of investing in people because it offers a significant asset when they engage with future job interviews. When candidates attend an interview, whilst the generic certificates which candidates bring with them are indeed important, such certificates only offer recognition of textbook and theoretical understanding, but demonstrating a practical and contextual understanding gives a distinct advantage. Now that is really investing in people. In today's modern business world, IT is the business and the business is IT. Today, IT must respond to change at the speed the business dictates, not at the speed IT dictates, which was how things were when I joined IT many years ago, but certainly not today. So to achieve this, IT need to do things in smaller, more manageable bite-sized chunks. This not only supports continuous improvement, but allows us to respond to change more quickly and, if need be, redesign in an efficient manner. After all, the customer does not always recognise the right product until they actually see the wrong product. So doing things in iterations will enable us to better accommodate this. We also want people to work in heuristic environments where people can express themselves and where new solutions will emerge. People are best placed in complex situations. Ideally, we do not want people being consumed with repetitive, robotic and predictable activities. In many cases, we can use robots to undertake such work. We also need to adopt techniques and methodologies such as shift left, meaning bringing something closer to the source. An example of shift left could be self-help. Someone once mentioned to me that a company they had previously worked in said if a user wanted a new keyboard, they were issued with a PIN number, and then they would walk down the corridor to a type of vending machine, and using this PIN number, a keyboard was dispensed there and then. I suppose this is a shift left approach, meaning the output has been dropped directly into the lap of the source itself. Adopting a shift left approach deflects the repetitive, mundane work and allows us to reposition people into more complex situations where people are really needed. Techniques such as swarming is another form of shift left. In the context of managing incident tickets, this is an alternative to adopting a tiered hierarchical approach, or something to consider operating alongside of by the way of introducing swarms when and where necessary. Swarming is where a single collaborative team of expertise come together temporarily, which improves communication and promotes sharing skills and knowledge across all teams, and focuses on avoiding queues. The problem with adopting a tiered hierarchical approach is tickets can bounce around the organisation in a silo-to-silo motion and equally can cause backlogs where specific specialist teams can become overwhelmed. As for swarming, we can introduce dispatch swarms, drop-in swarms or backlog swarms. There are challenges, however, with swarming, such as if you are wanting to monitor the cost per ticket, then this will appear to be expensive because higher skilled staff may be involved earlier, and it would be difficult to evaluate individual contributions because work is more collaborative, and not to mention finding the right people to swarm can be difficult, which would require executive support and a loosening of rules by moving away from a rigid process culture of self-reliance in teams. All that aside, it should be noted that if a culture exists where second or third line level of expertise think they are doing the service desk a favour when working on incident tickets, then this culture should be reviewed because everyone should be involved with incident management. And of course, we have data analytics, where data is manipulated into context and meaning, machine learning, artificial intelligence, continuous integration and continuous deployment and delivery, and not to mention robotic process automation. These are all capabilities which contribute to the efficiency and helps us to compete in today's modern market. So, almost all services today are IT enabled. Businesses use technology to communicate, transact, market and promote itself. Technology helps us to execute processes, design products and services, and design for business strategy, risk and security, etc. Someone once said to me, "Trevor, if you want to truly become transparent within the business and understand how IT underpins business activities, then catch an order when it first comes into the organisation. Hang on to it until the order has been fully satisfied, and you will learn everything about IT and how IT underpins the business." How true this is. Silos are breaking down and cross-functional teams are being utilised more widely. In other words, we promote collaborative working. In simple terms, we mean we either fail together or we succeed together, not in parts. There is most certainly a need for operational agility, increased velocity, and a balance of predictability and stability. We need to respond fast and in the right direction. Speed to deliver and speed to recover is essential in today's modern business world. With all of this in mind, service management has to support this organisational shift. Service management sets a level of competency within an organisation. Service management represents capability. In other words, if I gave a group of people £1,000 each and asked them to turn this into £10,000, we know that some would come back in debt, whereas others would come back with some loose change. And others would indeed have turned the £1,000 into £10,000. How is this when each person has been allocated exactly the same resource? This is because each applied different levels of capability. This is management. In this example, cash is a resource and management is the capability. Resource and capability combined equate to what we refer to as a service asset. We often hear service providers say that they deliver value. Well, I am sorry to spoil the party, but providers do not really deliver value. Maybe this is true indirectly, but the provider actually delivers outputs. An output is defined as a tangible or intangible deliverable following an activity. In other words, the box which we push out of the door, as to speak. So let's assume this output is a payroll system. Then the outcomes, the results that is, which the consumer wants from this output, is to calculate salaries and pensions, pay monies into people's bank accounts, and to submit taxes due to the government, etc. This is where value is created. So the provider must map outputs to outcomes and map outcomes to value, as opposed to just building and fixing stuff and walking away. Secondly, we also need to understand and make visible the band of visibility. This represents the portion of the product or service which the consumer actually sees and comes into contact with. For example, if you go to a restaurant as a service consumer, you will see the waiters and the waitresses, the dining area and the check-in and check-out, etc. Typically, you will not see the kitchen, meaning from the provider's perspective, there are portions of the product or service you do not see or come into contact with. If you did, then the band of visibility from the provider's perspective would be wider. Of course, from the provider's perspective, they need to understand and make visible the entire geography and dimensions of the product or service. Okay, now the provider also needs to understand and make visible the line of visibility. The provider should forensically map the customer journey because they need to walk in the shoes of the service consumer. We need to understand the pain points, we need to understand the highlights, and we most certainly need to understand the moments of truth. A moment of truth is where the service consumer gets an impression or changes their impression, good or bad. And trust me, there are many moments of truth in a consumer journey. I find it absolutely scandalous that a provider dictates and lectures a service consumer when the provider has never even walked the journey end to end themselves. We should understand and make visible which provider teams interplay with which step or steps, and in turn understand the attributes that each team must promote to fulfill the expectations in those steps. And not to mention, whilst each team should promote the required specialisms required to satisfy each step, which they interplay, these teams should also promote a broad knowledge of the overall journey. especially those steps which they depend on and those steps that depend on them. Let's be clear, the provider cannot understand the journey of a service unless it involves the customer or more broadly the consumer in its analysis. So let's start with looking at the service journey. Services are end-to-end, and such a journey will typically comprise of several steps. So what is the customer doing in each step? From the customer's perspective, there are a number of things going on in each step of the journey, such as what encourages or discourages them from moving to the next step? What emotions does each step trigger? Are there questions that are difficult to find answers to? In which context could they get anxious? Could uncertainties cause them to give up and find a different service provider? What kind of obstacles do they confront in each stage? What are the cost and risk factors? When we consider the steps within the customer journey, these will depend on each service respectively. Taking a generic sales approach would comprise of sales contact, then identify needs, then demonstrate the solutions, and then agree, and then of course onboard the new customer, and of course the steps would continue such as delivering support and so on. However, this is where the line of visibility would be viewed, which sits within the band of visibility. The band of visibility represents the portion of the product or service the service consumer actually sees, feels and comes into direct contact with, and at the same time, how much of the consumer's environment the provider actually sees and comes into contact with. And within the line of visibility, this is where we see the touch points and service interactions. I will clarify touch points and service interactions later. Now, there are portions of the product or service which the consumer does not see, which sit outside of the band of visibility, such as the backroom resources, activities and systems, etc., to provide sales and marketing resources to support the step sales contact, and the same to support the step demonstrating solutions, and of course the resources needed to support onboarding, etc. That said, it is important from the provider's viewpoint to determine how much of the customer's environment needs to be seen and understood, and in some cases to interact with. In other words, should the band of visibility be wider at the consumer's end? This is especially important with digital products and services where collaborative systems become essential. So to quickly summarise, we have the band of visibility which represents how much of the product or service the consumer actually comes into direct contact with and how much of the consumer's environment the provider actually sees and comes into contact with. And the line of visibility is where we see the touch points and service interactions. In each of these steps, there will be touch points and/or service interactions. A service interaction is a touch point, but not all touch points are interactions. Let me explain. A touch point in simple terms could be simply looking through a shop window or visiting a website, whereas a service interaction is a service action that takes place with a provider. This could be consultancy, contacting the service centre, or even installation and setup, etc. An interaction with a chatbot would be deemed as a service interaction. From the consumer's perspective, it is here touch points and interactions where potentially moments of truth will lie. You may recall we said earlier, a moment of truth is where the customer, the consumer, gets an impression or changes their impression, good or bad. So with all of this in mind, the journey steps, the touch points and service interactions, and understanding what sits inside and outside of the band of visibility and where potential moments of truth lie, along with identifying who the consumer is, for example, a customer, a sponsor, or a user, or any stakeholder, such as a regulator or member of the community, which would be applicable typically with the public sector. However, identifying the consumer type is important because these will each have different perceptions of value. Okay, we then need to identify the provider teams who directly and or indirectly interplay with each journey step. Once we make all of this visible, it becomes endless where improvements can be identified, including where provider teams and or roles require skills training and how these teams need a broader knowledge in addition to their specialism or specialisms. In other words, how they collaborate. So in conclusion, where are we now? Are we here or are we here? And are we able to identify opportunities for improvement? So in the context of IT, from a business perspective, we are going to look at cost to value. Therefore, let us use a heat bar where we can translate cold being pure cost and hot representing maximum value. Okay, firstly we have what IT refer to as the infrastructure, comprising of hardware and the operating systems, and of course the networks and comms, etc. As a crude analogy, we could refer to this as the highway, the motorway. From a business perspective, this is pure cost. There is no return on this investment. So moving up the heat bar, we have business applications. This is where the business starts to see a return on its investment. This is because through the use of business applications, information can flow across the infrastructure. Using the highway analogy, this is the equivalent to the car. In other words, we are able to move around the infrastructure. But this is not quite enough. If the business really wants to maximise on its investment, what does the business need to focus on next in order to realise the full potential? What is it that the business perceive to be of the highest order? It is indeed processes. This is most certainly where the business place enormous importance to achieve maximum value. This is because whilst ensuring the infrastructure is in place, and of course we have the right business applications in position, the key is not just that the business can move information around the infrastructure, but how we do this. It is processes that describe behaviour. Processes represent the way we move around the infrastructure. Taking the highway analogy, what we are saying is how well are the journeys signposted. In other words, how quickly and in what state do we arrive at our destination? Simply put, how efficient are the journeys? So in summary, from a business perspective, it's all about how we cash in and how we cash out. Some organisations cash in and snake around the organisation and eventually cash out, whereas other organisations cash in and cash out speedily, efficiently, dynamically and effectively. I could take the entire day providing examples of organisational workflows filled with waste, bureaucracy and low-value business activities, and not to mention through a lack of visibility where opportunities for improvement are missed.
Get it? Get it.
Firstly, an organisation is defined as a person or a group of people with its own functions and responsibilities, authorities and relationships to achieve its objectives. As we can see in this example, this enterprise is segmented into 4 organisations: production, HR, finance and IT. And their respective functions, responsibilities and authorities could comprise of those which we can see here. We can see finance could be divided into accounts payable, accounts receivable and payroll, or we may prefer to call these teams, one of the same thing. As for IT, in this example, IT has been divided into teams, such as the service centre, end user support, core business apps and infrastructure. Now, what we do not want is for these teams to operate and work in silos. These teams must work in collaboration, working to the same goals and objectives of the organisation as a whole. In other words, we should succeed together or fail together, not in parts. So, the goals and objectives of the organisation should cascade into each team and mapped accordingly. Unfortunately, this is not the case for every organisation. In some cases, we see various teams within the same organisation at opposite ends. In fact, this situation presents competing objectives, and this is the last thing we want. Let's not forget that the goals and objectives of the organisation represent the strategy of IT. And of course, the strategy of IT cannot stand on its own when it is part of the business, meaning IT strategy is derived from the strategy of the business. So, such competing objectives can end up competing with the business itself. Now, I accept with my next point, I may be exaggerating and oversimplifying things. However, to make my point, we see organisational goals and objectives published on posters or on walls around the company, promoting a culture that is forward-thinking. But we know, in reality, this is quite the opposite. Or promoting a culture which focuses on value for the customer, when in reality this is not true. And a culture that always delivers with a smile. Well, that's a laugh within itself. There are several potential issues, and the solution in crude, simple terms lies with management. Whatever we design, we should design top down and implement bottom up. So one thing we must do is codify the goals and objectives of the organisation and map these to each team respectively, and if need be, to each individual team member accordingly. Defining an organisation. An organisation is defined as a person or group of people with specific functions, responsibilities, authorities and relationships to achieve objectives. For example, this enterprise is divided into 4 organisations: production, HR, finance and IT, each incorporating distinct functions and responsibilities along with authorities, etc. So let's take a closer look at finance as an organisation. Typically, this organisation will include accounts payable, accounts receivable and payroll. Similarly, IT will typically encompass the service centre, end-user computing, core business apps and infrastructure, etc. These are the functions, responsibilities, authorities which belong to the organisation respectively. Often, these functional responsibilities and authorities can be referred to as teams. I hope this makes sense. So, what is organisational culture? Well, organisational culture is defined as encompassing shared norms and values that shape employee behaviours and interactions. It is essential to understand its components to foster a positive and productive work environment. In other words, how employees interact with each other. Organisational culture has a significant impact on employee satisfaction. A positive organisational culture can enhance employee satisfaction, leading to higher retention rates. And organisational culture will influence effectiveness. Organisational culture plays a crucial role in determining the overall effectiveness and success of an organisation. Let us understand some of the key elements and components of culture. Firstly, it is important to understand the difference between cooperation and collaboration. Cooperation is defined as working with others to achieve your own goals, which may be part of a common goal. Whilst cooperation is important to ensure standardisation, cooperation in isolation, however, promotes a culture of working in silos. Collaboration is the action of working with someone to produce or create something. From a business perspective, let's take a bakery as an example. Collaboration is about everyone working together to put that loaf of bread on the shelf in the supermarket. Such goals and objectives become dynamic and real-time. Collaboration is about succeeding together or failing together, not in parts. In terms of IT service management, as an example, focusing solely on an incident management report is a prime example of working in silos. Whilst this is an important metric, it's one of many metrics to consider. It's fine if the IT service centre meets its target, but did we ensure the product reached the market on time? This requires collaboration and understanding of the bigger picture beyond our individual specialisms. If we adopt a siloed mentality, is there any wonder why the business are not interested in our service level management reports when they take an inside-out approach rather than an outside-in approach, meaning by starting with the business values and perspectives, thus focusing on what the customer perceives as value. The key elements and components of culture also include the organisation's vision. The organisation's vision defines its long-term goals and aspirations, guiding employee behaviour and decision-making, and not to mention core values. Core values represent the fundamental beliefs of an organisation, influencing its culture and shaping employee actions. In fact, the ITIL guiding principles play a key part here. Many IT employees are unaware of the company's vision, and probably more important, many are not aware of the organisation's current strategy, simply because it has never been effectively communicated. This misalignment affects behaviour and productivity. And let's be clear, IT cannot have a strategy that stands alone. It has to be part of the business strategy. And not to mention, rituals and symbols are equally elements of culture. Rituals and symbols are observable elements of culture that reinforce the organisation's identity and motivate employees. And last but not least, stories and narratives. Stories and narratives convey the organisation's history and values, helping to connect employees to its future. We should also consider organisational structures. There are several different structures. However, let's consider the most common. We have functional structures, typically with an emphasis on hierarchy. Functional structures tend to promote high levels of control and a clear chain of command, with a view of facilitating stability and efficiency within the organisation. However, decision-making is often pushed upwards, which can take time and cause delays. We also have matrix structures, typically with an emphasis on working cross-functionally. Matrix structures have dual lines of reporting. In fact, in some cases, multiple lines of reporting. This structure promotes greater agility and provides the best environment for servant leaders to function. Not to mention, decision-making is typically faster in view that decision-making is pushed closer to where the work gets done. There are also flat structures which are similar to matrix and where there are virtually no decision-making barriers. However, this is not always possible as a company organisation grows. A combination of flat and matrix can provide the perfect environment, especially where agility and speed are essential.
Get it. Get it.
Leadership plays a pivotal role in establishing and nurturing organisational culture. Effective leadership models which align with the desired outcomes significantly influence employee engagement. There are different influences regarding leadership styles, each with various influences such as transformational leadership. Transformational leadership encourages innovation and inspires employees to exceed their expectations, fostering a positive organisational culture. Transactional leadership. Transactional leadership focuses on structure and clear rewards for performance, impacting organisational efficiency and culture. And servant leadership. Servant leadership prioritises the needs of team members, promoting a supportive culture and enhancing employee satisfaction and retention. These leadership styles can impact organisational culture. Leaders must adopt styles that align and reinforce with the desired culture. It is important to adopt strategies for effective cultural change. To effectively change organisational culture, leaders must adopt a strategy to communicate a clear vision. Leaders must articulate a clear and compelling vision for cultural change to guide the organisation. There should also be a strategy for employee involvement. Involving employees in the cultural change process fosters ownership and buy-in, leading to better outcomes. There should also be a strategy for modelling desired behaviours. Leaders should exemplify the behaviours they want to see in their teams, setting a standard for others to follow, and equally there should be a strategy to promote continuous assessment and feedback. Ongoing assessment and feedback mechanisms are essential to measure the effectiveness of cultural change initiatives. When we consider productivity and efficiency, a well-defined organisational culture can streamline practices and processes, thus making workflows more efficient and reducing bottlenecks. And a well-defined culture can enhance collaboration, thus leading to better communication and teamwork. And a well-defined organisational culture can improve goal alignment. Aligning organisational culture with strategic objectives increases the likelihood of achieving organisational goals efficiently. Culture can also encourage or discourage innovation and creativity. A supportive culture can significantly enhance the potential for innovation by encouraging new ideas and risk-taking. Risk-taking encouragement. Organisations that embrace risk-taking create an environment where creativity and innovative solutions can thrive. And open communication. Open communication facilitates the flow of ideas and collaboration, which are essential elements for fostering creativity and innovation. Simply put, organisations that promote a culture of risk-taking and open communication are more likely to foster innovation and creative problem-solving. Organisations must navigate cultural challenges resulting from diverse workforces. Therefore, managing cultural diversity is critical for success in a global marketplace. Managing cultural diversity involves recognising and valuing different perspectives while creating an inclusive environment. Organisations must develop strategies to leverage diversity for enhanced performance. People have different skills, capabilities, interests and beliefs, etc. and these should be welcomed and supported. However, the backbone of such diversity in the workplace should be based on a service-dominant logic, defined as humans applying their competencies to benefit others and reciprocally benefit from others' applied competencies through service for service exchange. So in summary, to manage cultural diversity, it is important to recognise perspectives. Effective management of cultural diversity starts with recognising and valuing different perspectives that individuals bring to the table and create inclusive environments. Organisations must create inclusive environments that foster respect and understanding among diverse groups of people, and not to mention leveraging diversity. Leveraging diversity can enhance organisational performance by encouraging innovative ideas and fostering collaboration.
Get it. Get it.
Welcome to Understanding Value Streams. The agenda items for this learning session comprise of understanding value streams, designing a value stream, and the benefits of value streams in IT service management. So, understanding value streams. Value streams are a series of steps that deliver a product or service to the customer, ensuring all aspects are accounted for. Value streams provide visibility into how value is created, allowing organisations to understand their processes better. And because of this visibility, it enables analysis in terms of analysing value streams to identify improvement and efficiency, especially within IT service management. Simply put, by walking the value stream, we can identify potential opportunities such as introducing automation, shift left techniques, and equally how information and data is transferred between teams, and not to mention whether we are gathering the same information in one step that has already been gathered in a previous step. We can also identify waste and unnecessary bureaucracy, etc. Designing a value stream. Let's consider the fundamental steps when designing a value stream. The first step is to define the use case or scenario by describing the demand, the trigger created by the demand, and the outcomes created by the value stream. Step 2 would be to document the steps from demand to value. Then step 3 would be to map the steps to the operating model. And step 4, if required and necessary, decompose the steps into actions and tasks. And then step 5 would be to identify the contributing practices and associated resources to the successful completion of each step. So, what are the challenges and best practices? Organisations may face challenges when integrating value streams into IT service management, such as resistance to change. One of the major challenges organisations face is resistance to change from employees and stakeholders, hindering integration efforts. Organisation change management as a practice would be useful in these situations. A good measure of organisational change management is the curve from denial to acceptance. A lack of understanding about value streams and IT service management processes can impede successful integration and implementation. As for best practice, it is therefore important to establish stakeholder engagement. Using the technique stakeholder analysis can help here. Engaging stakeholders effectively can foster collaboration and support, which is essential for successful integration, and not to mention continuous feedback. Implementing a continuous feedback loop allows organisations to adapt and improve their IT service management practices over time. One of the primary benefits of value streams is enhanced service delivery. This is achieved by streamlined processes. Streamlining processes helps organisations eliminate inefficiencies, leading to faster service delivery and improved customer satisfaction. A customer-centric approach, focusing on customer needs, ensures that services are tailored to meet their demands, enhancing the overall experience. And reliable services. Reliable services are achieved when organisations consistently meet or exceed customer expectations through optimised workflows. So, considering improved efficiency and productivity, value streams help identify and eliminate waste, and by optimising processes leads to improved efficiency and productivity, and therefore through optimising processes, IT teams can focus on high value activities that drive performance. Ultimately, effective value stream management leads to higher customer satisfaction and better business outcomes, and not to mention, satisfied customers are more likely to remain loyal to a brand, which enhances long-term business success, and satisfied customers will recommend services to others, creating valuable referrals and driving new business. So, in conclusion, value streams are essential for enhancing service management efficiency. They help organisations understand their processes better. Designing value streams allows organisations to visualise their service delivery processes, identifying areas of improvement and optimisation. And by implementing effective value streams, organisations can significantly improve customer satisfaction and service delivery outcomes.
Get it.